costs and barriers to energy development on federal lands. I'll begin with the most egregious of this bill's deficiencies, which is the outsourcing of federal regulatory power to a non-government entity with a clear ideological agenda. Section 2 of the legislation cites disclosure standards created by the SASB, as discussed, and it proposes to mandate that entities seeking or holding leases on federal land file reports which comply with the SASB standards in effect at the date of the filing of that report. Thus, if and when the SASB makes changes to its standards, the disclosure requirements for federal leaseholders and seekers will automatically change by action of law. This means that the SASB would have the regulatory power to set disclosure standards for federal leasing. The SASB is not a government agency. Its board is not appointed by the President or confirmed by the Senate. It is entirely independent of the federal government. Put simply, this is unconstitutional delegation of federal regulatory power. While the Supreme Court has historically been very lenient about delegations of congressional authority to executive branch agencies, it has been unequivocal that delegation of legislative powers to private entities is unconstitutional. The delegation of the regulatory power to set disclosure standards to the SASB cannot pass constitutional muster. The reasoning for this blanket constitutional bar is made obvious by the situation we see before us. The SASB is an explicitly ideological organization. It seeks to promote adoption of its views of what constitutes sustainability. It was founded and funded by organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies, and as previously discussed, Michael Bloomberg is a former chairman of the organization, and he remains chairman emeritus today, even as he runs for president, on a platform of halting fossil fuel development on federal lands. The legislation would give this ideological organization the unchecked power to set regulatory standards for federal leasing. The conflict here is obvious. Handing regulatory authority to the SASB as proposed in this bill is analogous to a conservative member of Congress proposing a bill to hand over some aspect of federal regulatory authority to the Heritage Foundation. Both the title of this legislation and the press release and discussion from its sponsors imply that there is a lack of transparency about the current leasing process on federal lands, but this is very misleading. The disclosures contemplated in the SASB guidelines are, in many instances, duplicates of information that leaseholders already report to federal agencies, while other parts of the guidelines are completely irrelevant to the operation of a federal lease. For example, leaseholders already report emissions to the EPA, including for greenhouse gases. However, unlike existing reporting requirements, the SASB doesn't actually include any metrics for how compliance with their reports can be assessed. Likewise, the SASB standards include disclosures about biodiversity impacts, but federal leases are already subject to the NEPA process. For additional SASB sections like business ethics, community relations, and security and human rights, besides those being vague concepts, it's not clear what bearing those subjects have on a company's competency to manage a lease on federal lands. So rather than a genuine bid for transparency, this legislation is more described as an effort to impose higher costs on energy leasing on federal lands. The vagueness of many of the SASB guidelines serves a dual purpose in this raising of costs. On the front end, a company has to come up with new accounting and compliance processes in order to collect and produce the information demanded. And then on the back end, the vagueness opens up new avenues for litigation from anti-development organizations over judgment call calculations or assertions that one of the extraneous disclosure categories hasn't been completed satisfactorily. Use of the SASB guidelines is also a backdoor effort to achieve regulatory goals under the guise of transparency that otherwise could not pass Congress. For example, one of the primary criticisms of the Obama administration's proposed methane regulations was the steep cost of new monitoring equipment needed to comply with the rules. Requiring the SASB disclosures would impose those same monitoring costs, though this time not even with the justification of trying to reduce methane emissions. As drafted, the legislation is poorly constructed. It's expensive, duplicative, and frankly unconstitutional. Mandating the SASB standards looks suspiciously like using federal power to coerce participation in a private NGO's pet project. If Congress wishes to create standards for sustainability for federal leasing or for any other federal contracting, the appropriate process is to provide a mandate to the relevant federal agencies to develop standards through the administrative process. In addition to having the advantage of being constitutional, such a process has long-standing administrative procedure and legal principles that ensure the rights of the companies and individuals impacted by the standards are protected. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. And now